Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom can remain free because of generous donors like you. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so online, or you can send payments through Facebook Messenger. Don't forget to tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy this ministry as well. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any podcasts.
You can listen to my daddy every single day, like in the gym, in the car, or just at home. Glimpse of the Kingdom is awesome!
You might not have thought about this before, but hopefully those who've done the Bible for all it's worth and have been in my groups before, you've asked the question, what's the genre? What kind of literature is this? And to ask that question of all the letters or documents or books of the Bible is always a good question. Genre, what is the literary type? And scholars for a long time classified the Gospels as a genre, different kinds of genres for a long time. What they mostly agreed upon was that they're not biographies because they don't sound like modern biographies. There's a German scholar named Rudolf Bultmann who championed that. And then back in the 70s, in fact, probably around 77, 78, I think it was, my former professor, Charles Tauber, wrote a response to Bultmann. I'm just giving a little nerd talk here. And he called the book, it's a real short book. He's called, What is a Gospel? And he takes Bultmann to task. And that changed the whole tide. You think Bultmann's wrong here, because when you compare the Gospels to the ancient form of biography, things really stand out. And so that was a watershed book, What is a Gospel? Then several years later, a British scholar named Richard Burridge came up with a book called, it's an homage to Taubert's book, What Are the Gospels? Now that book has won the day. That most New Testament specialists in the world think Burridge nailed it. He also thinks that, in general, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are ancient forms of biographies. And so you have, of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke. I just started writing John as I'm saying the word Luke. Luke, and then, of course, John. So we have Matthew, Mark, and Richard Burridge, and now it's the standard view that all these Gospels in general are ancient form of biography. In fact, in Greek, they would have called it a bios. That's where we get the word, it looks like this if you were bios. That's where we get the word biography. But as ancients called it a bios, a bios. A good translation of bios is a life. A life. The life of Jesus. So the Gospels really are lives of Jesus. There are different kinds of biographies in the ancient world. Luke, Acts fits more in a historiography. It's more formal. Matthew, Mark, and John are also a little different, but they do share in common several features of an ancient biography. But again, I'm not going into a lot of details. I don't know if you care. If you do, go read Richard Burridge's book, and there are other books I can recommend on that. This is a massive study. But I want to give you a heads up that when you read these documents in the ancient world, the standard New Testament view for several decades now is that the Gospels are an ancient form of biography or life. Now, who cares? Well, it actually does matter. If it's an ancient form of life, then the question is, as all genre study is, if it's not apocalypse, if it's not a psalm, if it's not a history book, you might say First Kings, what is a life and what's the purpose of a life? How should we understand it? Well, lives in the ancient world had similarities. And there's some key similarities that help us read the Gospels better. And before I tell you, I just want to make sure, sorry if I'm belaboring the point too much, just remember, the reason why we care about genre or literary type is to figure out what are the right questions to ask of the text. If this is poetry, I don't need to ask what kind of butterfly is it in your stomach. You're asking the wrong question. You can ask it. You're going to get silly answers. Or I'm going to look at you and say, that's the wrong question. Well, who does he think he is? I can read just as much as he can read. You can read butterfly. And you can do. That's not how I interpret it. You don't have to interpret it how you want to. It's just that would it matter to you if I said, it's very likely that butterfly in my stomach, in her stomach, is an idiom because that's poetry. Does it affect at all the questions they're asking? To the average common sense brother, well, yeah, it matters. Whether it's a cookbook or whether it's poetry or it's Stephen King. The same thing is true about an ancient literature. If you'll stop just for a second and say, this isn't Holy Bible, it is. But if you'll skip that for a second and say, what's the genre? Well, they ask the right questions of the text. Okay. So this is common. We do this all the time. One of the key features of a life of someone, and there are a lot of them in the ancient world. Greeks and Romans love to write lives or biographies. There's some similarities to modern biographies, but there are also big dissimilarities. But one of the major things you emphasized in an ancient life was the main character. The main character was always the point. To use literature, technical vocabulary, the protagonist. Who is the main dude they're talking about? And it was always a dude, as far as I know. It was always a guy. And I'm saying this because you need to understand that just like other ancient biographies, the Gospels are about one main character. These are not about Israel. The Gospels are not about the disciples. They're not about the earliest followers. They're not about the weather patterns. It's not about what kind of food they ate all the time. It is about Jesus. Jesus is the main character. And if you understand that as a genre, if you find that compelling, and you might not, but in scholars, I do find that compelling, which means, and Burge really helped me see this. I was at an SBL conference when he did a long presentation, and of course I read his book and all that. I think he's exactly right. So instead of, for example, when the disciples don't get Jesus, it was, oh, my dumb disciples, something wrong with them. No, if we read this in the genre, we ask the right question. The question to ask is not, what was wrong with those dumb disciples? The question is, what is it about Jesus that makes him so hard to understand? Do you see the difference? One is, what's wrong with those disciples? Let's reflect a lot more on Peter's boldness, whatever that means, versus, what does it say about Jesus that someone like Peter will respond like that? And when I did How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, I always beat that drum over and over. It's always good to ask, what does it tell us about God in the Old Testament narrative? What does it tell us about what God's doing in the New Testament? That's a good way to read the Bible. So in biography genre, you always, what does this tell me about the major character, not about the sub-characters? David, does that mean I can never ask the question, what the disciple? No, it doesn't mean you're never going to ask the question. It just means that, if this is true, it means that the authors of the Gospels were not trying to talk much about the disciples. They're just not the point. They're a character in the story. There are different characters in the story. The crowd can be a story. Part of the story is I'll talk, in fact, the sermon this Sunday a little bit more. But the point always is, how does this help us understand Jesus? Or from their view, it's always about the main character. That's always a good question to ask. So, and Matthew's a similar way. That means, number two, they chiefly, if not only, tell episodes or stories or sayings or controversies, whatever, that emphasize the main character. This means they are not trying to tell every detail. That's a key difference between the most modern biographies. If I have a modern biography of Winston Churchill, we're going to learn about him and his dog, what his dog ate, when he was born, his cousins, his pet frog's name. I mean, the point is you just kind of spill all out there. I like C.S. Lewis, and you can read biographies about Lewis and where he grew up in Ireland and all this. Or my wife just bought me this little magazine, a special edition on J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's behind the scenes, has pictures of him when he went to World War I and his friends and where he grew up and the land, and it's all these details. That is not what they did in the ancient world. They would only tell episodes, sayings, and stories to emphasize the main character of the main character, the metal, the character, the inside of the main protagonist. It means, and this is why in scholarship it's very common to call the people who wrote these Gospels editors. Editors, or sometimes they'll call them evangelists. Evangelist, meaning they really are trying to proclaim the gospel. For a lot of, my professor used to say, let me drop a footnote. If I may drop a little footnote, this is usually, in my experience, humbly, one of the most difficult things for the modern average Christian to grasp. Not the first one. They go, oh, I can see that. It's the second one. And it's because, in my experience, and maybe no one in this room or watching online, but in my experience, almost 20 years of ministry has taught me, most Christians think the Gospels really are stenographic courtroom reports of everything that happened in the life of Jesus. Or every conversation that happened. is just straight up recording like you had a video camera and someone just watched it and watched it on the TV and just wrote down everything that happened. Nobody in scholarship thinks that. Zero people who know anything about scholarship know that, because that's not how the genre functioned. They deliberately, as editors of a newspaper, chose the stories they wanted to write about. And they wrote it in a way and in an order, which I'll go into in a second, that they wanted to write it to make a point about the character so that you got the point they wanted to make. If I want to talk about Susan being so wonderful as a musician and I wrote a life of her, I would only tell those stories that demonstrate sometimes she was spectacular, and sometimes the crowds cheered. Sometimes they didn't understand. Sometimes she was reflective. Sometimes she was this, and sometimes, but I'm trying so hard to get the audience to hear my point of view about you as a musician. And I would deliberately choose stories and put them in the order and so forth I wanted to make the message come across. I'm the editor. I have the freedom to shape the material, and I don't want to use that song. I don't want to use that time. Remember that time when that, no, I don't want to talk about that one. Well, why not bring that one up? Because that doesn't make the point I want to make. Does that make sense? So this is usually the hardest part, but it's just true. There's an enormous amount we do not know about Jesus. We don't know almost anything about his childhood. We have no idea what he looked like. We have no idea what his favorite color was, what he sounded like, whether he joked. I think he did a little bit for a couple reasons, but what he looked like when he was mad. I mean, how often did he urinate? What was his favorite food? There's an enormous amount. Who are his friends? See, everyone thinks the apostles were his friends. It never says that. Disciples weren't chosen to be his BFF. The disciples were chosen to be leaders in the church. It never says that. In John's gospel, it says the one whom he loved, his friends. That was Lazarus. That was someone else. But the apostles weren't chosen to be his friends. So most people think, oh, he just picked his buddies. That's not what the Gospels actually say. So my point is, there's so much we just don't know. There's a whole lot of the Gospels that demonstrate Jesus wandered, not wonder with an O, wandered, I'm trying to do that in a good Southern accent, walked around, perambulated, and did things that we just don't know. He just shows up all of a sudden in an episode. He wasn't with the disciples. In the early morning, he went away to go pray. They're on the boat, and all of a sudden, Jesus walked on the water like, they're scared. That's a ghost. But we don't have any clue what Jesus was doing between the last time they saw him and now he's on the water. What was he doing all that time? Why is it in John's gospel, which I get to more in a little bit, why is it in John's gospel is almost completely from a different geographical location, Judea and Jerusalem, while these three gospels are on Galilee? Well, how in the world did Jesus know Lazarus and Mary and Martha? You ever wonder that? That's only in John's gospel. When did he meet him? And the synoptic gospels, I'll talk about more in a second. I'm making this point here emphatically because it's usually so difficult for people to grasp. He comes up and says, Peter, James, and John, come follow me. And they go, drop the nets and run. Wow. They must have really saw glory about the guy. Well, maybe. Most scholars don't think that's what happened at all. Jesus grew up with these dudes. He knew them. Their parents knew each other. It's in a small fishing community. So Mark, Matthew, and Luke just jump into the point when his ministry begins. There's a whole bunch we don't know. They could have camped out and had fish for 15 years, and then all of a sudden it picks up on an episode, and they drop their nets and followed him. But everyone assumes they're strangers until that point. There's no reason to assume that. You only assume they're strangers if you don't notice an ancient genre biography. If you assume it's a stenographic record of everything that ever happened, you'll assume they're strangers. There's a whole bunch we just don't know. And we don't know because they chose not to put it in there. And if you don't believe that, again, just read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then go read John. And see how much is so different. There's a lot we just don't know. That's not because they don't love God. It's not because they're trying to be deceptive. It's because that is perfectly acceptable in a genre. You're trying to make the audience get the point, the sermon that you really want them to get. And so you pick and choose the stories you want. The third thing that's characteristic of the ancient genre is they don't care much at all about chronology. They have no problem moving episodes wherever they want to move it to. Stories and sayings. They can move that junk where they want. I want to learn all about Chelsea and her rise to fame. Let's start at the end. When she was 98, she was on her deathbed. And then she said, in flashback, she's 32. Flashback, she's 17. Now she's 70. Now she's... In movies, well, that's really cool. It gets our attention. Well, that's what they did in the ancient world. They don't care about chronology. Matthew, Mark, and Luke... In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus overturns the money changer's temple at the very end of his ministry. It's the thing that causes him to be arrested and then killed. And John's Gospel's in John chapter 2. It's the first thing of his ministry. Now you can say, well, there are two different events. That's possible. It's also possible that the genre, that they don't care at all where the chronology went. I'll go back in a sec. I'll say more about that in a little bit. So these are some, again, today that's very different typically when you write a biography. Like I just said, C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, the books, the magazines will start at the beginning. Lewis was born in 1893 in Dublin, Ireland, wherever he was born. The main character is always the main point. They're going to tell the episode stories and sayings that they want to emphasize. Chronology doesn't matter much at all. And another thing is, and I'll move on after this, most lives or biographies, and certainly the Gospels, were intended, this is controversial, for a wide audience. For about a long time, a century, a lot of people still it's still pretty popular to believe that the Gospels are written from and for a local audience. That was the dominant view of New Testament studies. The last couple of decades, because of, I'm sorry, I don't know how much nerd detail to give you or not. The last couple of decades, there was a book written as a collection of essays by Richard Burge and others, British scholars, who argued, nope, it was written from a local community, but not for a local community. It was written from a local community, but it's supposed to go out to the wide world very quickly. So they don't deny that a local church helped form it. The new way to think about it is, for a lot of reasons, I think very good reasons, is it wasn't written just for the local community. It's not that Dennis said, I want to write a life of Jesus just for us, and we're going to hug it. And it's going to be our particular work of literature that we use in worship and discipleship all the time. That was the dominant view of gospel studies for at least 100 years. But now, the standard view is, I think it's safe to say standard. Certainly what I find compelling, for a lot of reasons, to save you time, is that it did arise from within a community. So a Matthean community, a Markan community, a church. If you don't like the word community, put the word church. So Dennis writes his a gospel that came out of the first Christian church, but he wrote it to be disseminated widely to every church down the street and to every town he could get it to. To the world, basically to their world. That's exactly right. And this is much, much more accepted today. The best SBO conference I'd ever been to was a presentation and debate on this issue. And man, it was awesome. It was a packed standing room only. Oh man, that was good stuff. That was a good one. Because that book had come out a few years ago, and no one really took it seriously. And so the panel discussion was almost all the authors of the book. And one or two people took them all on, and Margaret Mitchell from University of Chicago. She was great. It was fun. Good nerd stuff. Yes. Yes, sir.
Oh, I was
I'm just repeating it to make sure that they can't hear it too well unless I repeat it. Dennis, that's a very astute observation. One of the arguments made for a local community is that the documents, and we'll go there in a little bit, the documents themselves are anonymous. It doesn't say written by Matthew, written by Mark. Those titular designations come later, but they're early, but they're not the earliest manuscripts we have. And it's probably the case that they were anonymous on the documents because the local communities knew exactly who wrote it. It wasn't until it traveled somewhere else and they began getting collected, and then they said, well, whose is this? Well, that's the gospel. And literally in Greek, it's kata markan, according to Mark. It doesn't say Mark wrote it, it says according to Matthew, according to Mark, because it's the gospel. And so its distribution would probably force the hand to say, you got to write down who wrote this thing. And that's debate of who wrote it. We'll go there in just a second. But yeah, that's good. So these are general understandings. So, and we could go on, we could list other things if you want, but I just want to move ahead. Any questions or comments about that? I do want to move ahead. I did want to do this before we just jump into Matthew 1:1. Okay, very quickly. Some of you know this, some of you don't. If you don't be ashamed. If you do, bear with me for a second, because I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very common. And there's two Greek words. He said, Professor, the same one who said drop a footnote, he said, it comes from two Greek words, as all good words do. He said, synoptic means seen together. We call these I don't really care what you call them, but if I throw this term out there, synoptic gospels, seen together gospels. Well, who gives a rip? The point is, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very common. One of the first things I remember when I was younger, a teenager, when I really started reading the New Gospel, I thought, this is boring. They all sound the same. I'd never known that until I started reading. John is an odd stinking bird. He's the apple that fell well off the tree. He's his own little beast. He's just different. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' ministry is chiefly around Galilee. Galilee, chiefly around there. John's gospel, he's chiefly around Judea, down the south in Jerusalem, Judea/Jerusalem. And John's gospel, Jesus goes to the Passover in Jerusalem at least 3 times, which would make it at least a 2-year ministry. Everyone says 3 years, but that's anyway. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus talks more mysteriously. He talks about, he gives a lot of parables. John gives no parables. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus gives a lot of exorcisms and miracles. In John's gospel, he gives 7, and they're not called miracles, they're called signs, and they're always called signs. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom of God. John's gospel, Jesus talks about himself. On and on, me, all day long. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus can say things that imply he has some divine prerogative. He forgives sins. He will judge. He is Lord of the Sabbath. In John's gospel, ain't nothing implicit about it. Before Abraham was, I am. All those I am statements come only from John. So when you read them, they're quite different in the way they talk. Now, if you want, we can talk about that. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on. But there are distinctions. So if you haven't read your Gospels yet, just understand that when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're going to sound similar. And John's going to sound quite different. And if that bothers you, let's talk. Because that's an old let me rephrase that. We can talk because it's actually not that problematic. For people who are not used to that, it is. But I'm saying I can encourage you. So if you come talk, we can encourage you, and it's not that scary after all. Okay? Any question about that? Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Yes, sir. And I'm going to do more about that in just a second. Yes, sir. I thought you had your hand up. Yes, ma'am.
Is Mark considered to have been written first? A lot of Mark is quoted, almost all of Mark is quoted in the other books.
That's very good. That's about to go next. There are 2 theories of why in the world they're so similar. There's multiple theories. And to save you, again, technical jargon like the grease-spike hypothesis and all this stuff, I'm just going to keep pretty simple. There are 2 leading theories of how the Gospels got written. And it goes like this. Jesus preaches and teaches. His sermons and his talks get memorized by his disciples, and some by the crowds, and certainly by the people he healed. And the leading theory now by people like Richard Bauckham and others, and I think it's very good, is that the actual story, the stories of the healings, with those names attributed, like in Mark 10, Bartimaeus got healed, the blind beggar. Bauckham and others argue the reason why Bartimaeus' name is mentioned is because Bartimaeus told the story. And there's a lot of instances like that. Luke 24, it's Cleopas and the partner who's on the road to Damascus. Well, who's the partner's name? Bauckham and others argue you don't have it because who told the story probably? Cleopas. And so the story gets attributed to that person's name if they tell a story. You have a story in Mark chapter 11 now? I'm trying to confusing. With a woman that comes in and she pours alabaster jar, there's nardos. Usually translate that, they just give it nard, there's some oil, perfume. Disciples fuss at her, that could have been sold for a lot of money. He says, leave her alone. Which I would have said the same thing, like this woman's gone crazy. Don't you want to help the poor, Jesus? Don't you listen to your own preaching? He said, leave her alone, because she is anointing my body basically before burial. And then he says, and wherever the gospel is preached, she will be spoken of. We have no idea what her name is. Probably because she didn't tell the story. It's just the disciples remember that time. Remember that time, that woman? Remember that time? So these oral traditions and preaching, which he probably did preach over and over similar topics over and over. So it's not crazy to think he taught the model prayer twice or multiple times. Matthew and Luke have 2 different versions. He preached it, got memorized. He healed people, exorcised demons. They went back home, did you hear what happened? You know what happened? Dude was blind and this and then whatever. She had 12 demons. Remember that time? And these stories promulgated, and for a couple decades, churches were formed after he died and resurrected. Right away, they started worshiping his name, praising, on and on. This oral tradition kept being used in the church service. They'd stand up, read some Old Testament text. Someone would stand up, Crystal would stand up. I got another story. There was this one time I heard him on the side of the Sea of Galilee. And they tell these stories over and over in worship, over and over and over and over and over, for a couple decades. Then the issue is, when did it start getting written down? This is debated. Almost certainly it didn't happen before around AD 60. And there's Paul, the Apostle Paul, died in early 60s, around 62. And he mentions nothing about the Gospels whatsoever. There's not even any inkling of it. Well, that's possible they still existed. It's just more unlikely. And there's a lot of reasons, I don't know much time. There's a lot of reason to think the Gospels weren't written by then. It probably did get started in the 50s with Mark, but it probably didn't get finished between 60 to 70 AD. And so the very first Gospel that most scholars think was written was Mark. Most scholars think Mark was written. Not every, but that's by far the consensus. I'd say 95% of scholars think Mark. We call this Markan priority, that Mark got written first. And then I want to ask you permission if I can say a little nerd talk here. There's a guy, because maybe you never heard this before, and I want to make sure you hear this at least once in your life, okay? There's a church historian, his name is Eusebius. He writes in the 4th century. This won't help you be more like Jesus, so just interesting fun facts, okay? Eusebius is a church historian. He writes about a guy named Papias. Papias, probably how they pronounce it, I'm not sure. Papias was a bishop in Hierapolis, which is in Asia Minor, Turkey. And Papias lived right around, let's say, around the 110s AD. So this is early, stinking early. Well, we don't have any of Papias's documents, and that stinks. We don't have any of his letters, his books, his sermons, nothing. All we have is what Eusebius, 300 years later, tells us what Papias wrote. Eusebius has some copies, but we don't have we don't have any extant manuscripts. That's a bummer. There's a lot we don't have. But Eusebius says that Papias says, that's exactly right. Good. You're tracking with me. He said, she said, he said. Papias has some good quotes. And I won't read the whole quote for you, but one of it is two things that are really important. Papias says that Jonas Marcus, John Mark, that's his real Jonas Marcus, John Mark, I call him Mark for short, that Mark traveled with Peter and was his, there's debate on how to, it's irony, how to interpret the interpreter. He was his interpreter. Does that mean his translator? Or does it mean something like interpreter is someone who explains it? Explainer guy. Like, this is what he really meant. Many people think it means something like maybe a little both, but more like translator. Eusebius says that Papias says that Peter and Mark knew each other, and Mark traveled with Peter and got Peter's firsthand recollections, and he was his interpreter. I think, personally, it's a little both. I think it certainly means translator. I think it's because Peter's primarily spoke in what language? Aramaic. So Peter's mother tongue is Aramaic. Now, Peter would have known some Greek, but Marcus, a good Roman name, his real name is Jonas Marcus, Mark knew his Greek. So he translated, basically. So Mark said, Pete, talk to me, brother. They went to church together, he heard stories, and John Mark wrote it down. But what Papias says is that Mark didn't care much about the order. He said he put them basically in whatever order he wanted to put them in. But if you read Mark, you notice that's exactly what happens. We have no idea what day it is, what time it is. He just tells, Mark 4 is a bunch of parables of seeds and soil. He just shoves it all together in one, but everyone thinks it's a parable chapter. And so if the average Christian now goes, wow, Jesus was on a roll. He just preached on sow seed after seed after seed after seed, because that's the assumption that the gospel writers are simply writing a story of a stenographic record of everything he said when he said it. But again, in scholarship study, no one thinks that. Instead, Mark deliberately, as a life writer, biography writer, put all in what we call one chapter. Matthew 5 through 7, we call the Sermon on the Mount. Nobody in scholarship thinks Jesus really said all those things back to back to back to back to back, but Matthew instead has made it a quote-unquote sermon, one long body of material. And we think a theological reason why he did it. He wants him to sound like Moses, when Moses gives his farewell discourse in Deuteronomy. So Eusebius says, Papias says, Mark and Pete chatted, wrote a gospel. Papias also says something about Matthew. That's where I'm going with this. He says that, can I move on? Can I erase this? Okay, no extra charge for that. He says that Matthew, and this is where it's confusing. He says Matthew, he references the gospel written, he calls it basically Hebraic, or the Hebrew gospel. So, well, Matthew was not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek. And scholars for a while tried to translate backwards to see if there are Hebraisms. Doesn't work. So basically no scholar thinks today at all that Matthew was written on a Hebrew original and translated to Greek. No one thinks that anymore. I mean, in general, they don't. And it's not in Hebrew, it's clearly in Greek, because I'm looking at the Greek right in front of me. It's in Greek. So what do we do with that? Some said, this is what some scholars say, Papias is just wrong. Bless his heart, he's just wrong. He got wrong tradition. Others say, no, it's one key word he says. That Papias says it was written in the Hebrew. You know this word, it's just Greek, and you didn't know that. Dialectos. What do you think it means? Dialectos, what? Dialect. Well, the dialect today means language, like a dialect of a certain language. But there are scholars who've argued, if you look at the word dialectos in the ancient world, dialectos is not about the language spoken, but about the rhetorical style used. The rhetorical style used. If that's true, Papias is not saying it was written in the Hebrew tongue, Hebrew language. It was written in the Hebrew style. That's really intriguing because Papias goes on to say, unlike Mark, that is not in order, Matthew writes in the Hebrew dialectos. And he says, and he puts it in a particular order. So other scholars argue Papias isn't just wrong or mistaken or a dummy. He's deliberately saying Matthew's text is much more in order on purpose. He's ordered it on purpose. My own personal view is I think it's exactly the way to understand it. I think that fits the data the best. I don't think he means he wrote in the Hebrew gospel, though that is possible. I think he thinks it's rhetorical. And that is to say, and it's just true. Matthew, no matter how you look at the division, there's blocks of material. Mark is not like that. Okay. I'm going to move on past that. And then there's Luke and John. Okay, let me go back to the original question that Jana asked, and you're still waiting for an answer to your question, aren't you? Okay, most scholars think Mark was written first. So the oral tradition, and finally someone said, let's write a life down. The tradition is, which we don't know past Papias, maybe it's all lied and confused, or it's telling the truth, that Mark's gospel, Mark was not a disciple of Jesus. He'd have been a young man when that happened. That later on, he grew up and hung out with Pete, and then wrote a gospel story down, which is real intriguing because it's not the most popular gospel in the ancient church. The most popular gospel in the ancient church is the second one that was probably the second one written, and that's Matthew. Matthew is the most popular gospel. Probably for various reasons. Did you say why? Yes. That was Vanna. Like, Vanna, that's good ventriloquism. Her mouth is completely shut. She's going, yes, why? I'm like, that is impressive. We don't know for sure. We just don't. Probably a few reasons scholars posit. One is because it's so full. If you read the teaching and the sayings of Jesus, it's one of the fullest, certainly fuller than Mark. Secondly, it's the most quote-unquote Jewish of the Gospels. And for an early Jewish Christian movement, it really appeals to them. Another reason could simply be because the communities to whom it was written were much more stable than some of the other ones. And so it got cherished more and repeated more and copied more. That's also possible. So we just have to throw out those reasons. We're not exactly sure why. I think probably all those. Also, Matthew has the most connection with the Old Testament than the other four Gospels. So I tend to think it's that Jewishness that made it the most popular, because the earliest Christian movement for several decades if you were to walk into the average church, or they would call it gathering, ecclesia, community, let's say Jesus died you'll see this in the newsletter coming up. We know exactly, almost certainly when he died. It was I'm going to spare you the suspense. You're on my cover. I gave you the exact date that he probably died on. Either in AD 30 or AD 33. And then the 50, 67, by the time the gospel's probably written between 20 to 30 years before Mark is written. 20, 30 years. So as long as you've been alive, almost, all that time period, the oral tradition has been passing on and passing on and passing on. But in those first several decades, it was dominated by Jews. So if you'd walk into the average first Christian church between the AD 30 to 50 or 60, you'd have met a lot of Jews in church, not Gentiles. They did start creeping in early on, but that was mostly in other towns outside of Israel. You had to go to Berea and Ephesus and others. They're still Jews, but then it starts tipping toward Gentile land. But in the motherland of Israel, it's dominated by Jews. And that's almost certainly where Matthew was written, which is which I'll go into a second. All I'll say right now is we're not sure where, probably written in Syria. And maybe I'll tell you why in a second. So the dominant theory is Mark's written, then Matthew's written, and then Luke is written. And then we have no clue when John was written. We just don't. Most scholars think it's dead last. There's one problem with this theory. Well, several. One is we don't know for sure. We just don't know for sure. But I do think this is how it happened. Personally, John, I go back and forth and back and forth. Here's the deal. Very quickly, and we're going to move on, okay? About 93 to 98% of Mark is used in Matthew and Luke. Let's keep it even, say 93% of Mark shows up. That's a chunk. That's a big chunk into Matthew, right? And Luke's the same way. Luke is longer. It's the longest. But if you have Mark, Matthew, and Luke, there are times, stay with me here, there are times forget John for a second, because he's that apple that fell off the tree. Mark, Matthew, and Luke are similar. There are times when Matthew and Luke have stories, sayings, data, they have in common that's not in Mark. And sometimes they have things in common that disagrees with Mark. Well, how do you explain that? What the leading theory has been for about 150 years is they must have had another written document. How is that Matthew and Luke can have things word for word in common that's not in Mark? If they use Mark, which they did, how do they go word for word unless they're not looking at the exact same document? Now you look at it. Now, decades later or something. And so they came up with a theory, scholars did, that there must have been this hypothetical written source, which we don't have anymore, and they called it from the German word Quelle. They call it Q. I don't care what it's called, but it's this hypothetical early sayings document that must have, if it existed, it was written down within a few years of Jesus' death and resurrection. And it's primarily about the sayings of Jesus. Primarily recording the sayings of Jesus. So the leading theory in scholarship for well over 100 years is that Mark informed Matthew, and so did Q. And then Luke used Q, and he used Mark as well. Is that too confusing? And then what about John? Forget him, he's Oddbird.
It's like the ancient name of telephone.
Kind of the ancient telephone. Kind of like the telephone, except this would be written, unlike oral. That's kind of like that.
Dual relationship database.
Dual relation, yeah. In fact, this is called the two-source hypothesis. You call it dual relation database. Okay, this theory is still the dominant view, and it has fallen on hard times. It's hard times. Bless its heart. And there is for example, one guy, he teaches at Duke. I love him. His name is Mark Goodacre. He's British. He's I can't even do his accent. It's just a pristine, perfect British accent. He and others just attack the snot out of Q and say, y'all have gone crazy. Q does not exist. We have no evidence for it. It's all hypothetical. And he says, and many scholars say, no. It's like this. It's just like this. That's it. And that those things where they're similar, it means Luke used Matthew. Now, it doesn't explain everything. You've got some difficulties, but this is growing in popularity to get rid of Q. So if I were presenting a paper right now, I'd say, well, Q, if Q exists, if I were a scholar, So in a nutshell, those are two major theories, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John. But everyone agrees Matthew and Luke use Mark. Did Luke get Matthew filtered from Mark? And that's what's debated. And one quick thing. Well, David, what about, there are stories only in Matthew. There are stories that are only in Luke. For example, I don't know if you know this. For example, you don't have to right now. Go to Luke 15 one time. It's the lost chapter. Not really. It's the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, which is called the prodigal son. It shouldn't call that. Anyway, all lost stuff. That only shows up in Luke 15. My PhD had a class on the uniquely Lucan parables. That is, parables only show up in Luke. I did Luke 12. At one of the parables in Luke 12. Well, where does he get this information? If Luke didn't get it from Matthew and didn't get it from Mark, where did Luke get these stories from? Well, you said Q. The only problem with Q is Q is the letter used only for the material that Matthew and Luke have in common. So if it's uniquely Lucan, and what we call that unique material, this is very clever. We just call that L.
James. He got it from James.
Matthew has the same story in the Sermon on the Mount, all kinds of stuff. Now Luke 6 has a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, but some things only Matthew has. We call that M. So technically speaking, Matthew used Mark and some other stories. Luke probably used Matthew and certainly used Mark, maybe Q. No matter what your view of Q is, they still have unique material. No matter what your view of Q is, they still have unique material. And John's got tons of unique material. We'll just call it J for John. John, he's just got tons of unique material that shows up nowhere else. What's interesting, a little footnote, there's only one story that shows up in all four Gospels. You know what it is? The feeding of the multitude. All four Gospels. And it's in John's Gospel, it talks about the grass being green and some other stuff, and that's kind of cool because when you put these together, it actually helps inform the story and its historical reliability. It's the only story that shows up all four. Well, David, where does M and L come from? Why did Luke tell the prodigal son? Did he just make it up? Well, the answer is, well, no. What most scholars have said for 150, 200 years is the community in which it was written. The stories came from a church. And so they had stories that no other church had. And so by the time Dennis goes right down his gospel, the gospel of Jesus according to Dennis, there are stories that only Janet knew. Why? Because she was there. And that only Krista knew, so Krista. So he's got inside scoop. He also has the written document of Mark, and maybe Matthew too, but when he goes to write his own document, he's got stories no one else knew about. And then when that gets copied and passed on to other churches, they go, oh, look at there. I didn't know these stories. And what happens in the manuscript tradition is some of these stories get moved from gospel to gospel because they know them in their mind. They hear them in church service all the time. They move it. One example is in the Gospel of John. This is one of the most earth-shattering, sad things for people when they learn this fact. The woman caught in adultery in John 7:53 through 8:11. That almost certainly was not originally to John. There are other manuscripts where that story is in Luke. Other manuscripts. So anyway, that's another story. Don't lose your faith tonight on that. Please don't. Okay, so this is probably when they were written. And I'm going to go ahead.
So it wouldn't,
Please.
It wouldn't have,
Well, and Luke. No, very good question. The question is, if I can rephrase it just a little bit, tell me if I'm gotten you wrong. Won't some of the distinctions of the Gospels be explained by the fact that they have different audiences? Absolutely. That's what most scholars say. So, for example, in Matthew, there are several things that occur in Matthew that are Jewish customs that he does not explain. And most scholars assume it's because the audience would have understood what those concepts were. He talks about the drachma, whatever, the temple tax. Well, unless you're a Jew, no, Gentiles don't have a clue what that thing is. They don't go to the temple to give a tax. But if you read Mark's gospel, he'll explain things. For example, in Mark's gospel, and Jesus in prayer, remember the prayer in Gethsemane? In Mark, it's just the region of Gethsemane. In Matthew, it's called the garden. So we stick with the garden. And what does he call him? His father, he calls him what? Abba?
good place to be.
Remember the prayer? What does he say? Talk to me. Remember he says, and Jesus said?
Abba, Father.
Father. He says, Abba, Father. Well, probably not. Abba is Aramaic. Guess what Abba means?
Father.
It means father. So in Greek, it says Abba Pater. I'm sorry, I know you don't care about that. But anyway, Abba Pater. The word pater is the word father. It's a corruption of the word. But so when you say father, you're really just saying a corrupted Greek word. Now, why would he say that? Why would he translate it? Because the audience is Greek speaking. They don't know what Abba means. And in Galatians, when Paul says, and the Spirit cries in our hearts as being adopted as sons, and we cry out to him and cry out as Abba, and he's speaking to Gentiles, it shows Jesus called God Abba. Why in the world would that word of all the words stick in the tradition so much that Paul won't even translate it sometimes? He'll just say Abba, because that's what the Lord said. So you have these times where in the Gospels it's translated. It'll say, this was because, Mark's Gospel, the Pharisees fussed the disciples because they don't wash their hands. Mark will explain why. He'll say, well, it's because they cared about ritual purity, da-da-da-da. It's his parentheses. And that's probably because his audience is primarily Gentile. Most scholars think Mark was written more in Rome. And that's why.
Was Abba considered formal?
Was Abba more personal and Father more formal? No, ma'am. That's a good question. Now, as far as in other studies, Abba is kind of like Daddy. It wasn't weird for Jews to use Abba corporately. It was weird for a Jew to call God Abba. So using Abba is not weird. Using Abba as an individual stance is weird. Jews didn't talk that way.
But he was the son.
Well, that's one reason in studies, if I were teaching a class on the gospel presentation of Jesus, I would say all the way back to kind of Joachim Jeremias, he makes this point. He says, it's one of the distinctive points that in Jesus' own ministry, he assumed that he had a relationship with the Father other Jews did not have. He kind of went so far to say that it was unique in the ancient world. Scholars since Jeremias said, no, it's not unique. He went too far. Pendulum, no. Jews could talk that way, and they could talk that way. But Jeremias is right that one-on-one, that a person calls it versus in corporate prayer, we call you Abba. That's more common. But Jesus didn't say that much. He seemed to call him all right on. So that's interesting that it seems to be, it's idiosyncratic, if not unique. Sort of Matthew. I'll move on to Matthew. There's no other questions? So Matthew was we don't know when it's written. They are anonymous documents and all that, so we don't know when it was written. It all comes down to one simple thing, Susan, as it usually does. The fact is, and we won't go there right now, we're going to go there several weeks from now. What do you do with Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple? That's straight from Mark 13, but in Matthew, it's Matthew 24. And he predicts the destruction of the temple. Forever, scholars said, there's no way he could have really predicted, which means this had to have happened after the temple really fell. I'll say that one more time. So in Matthew 24, Mark 13, if Jesus predicts the fall of the temple, and we all know that did happen in AD 70, and there's no way Jesus could have predicted that, therefore the Gospels must have been written after AD 70. That's how the logic goes. What's the only problem with that? Is it conceivable that Jesus really could have predicted the fall of the temple? Even if you're a Satan worshiper, is it conceivable that Jesus could have thought that the temple ain't going to make it? The fact is, yes. We know that at the Dead Sea, heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls before? There was a community there called at the Qumran. Sometimes we call them the Essenes. There's a community of Jews. And these Essenes thought the same thing. We know that because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. They thought the temple was hopelessly corrupt and judgment's coming. They predicted that junk all the time. Jesus never said what year it's going to happen. He just said it's going to happen. In fact, he even said some of you won't taste death before it happens. This generation won't pass away until these things happen. He was right. So if you go the one path to say there's no way he could have predicted that, well, if that's the case, then the Gospels have to come after, maybe 70 plus after. If you think it's possible he did in fact predict it, well, then the date's off the table. Then the issue is, how likely is it that Paul never even alludes to a gospel in his ministry? The Apostle Paul wrote his letters first, AD. 1 Thessalonians is probably first, around AD 51. So why is it all through the 50s to about 62 when he died, 50s to early 60s, he never mentions it? So most scholars think Mark was written around AD 70. I think they're wrong. And there's a smaller group of scholars who think Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and maybe John all predate the fall of the temple. That's not the consensus. It's a minority group. I tend to go in that way. I think all of them are written in the 60s, I think.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. And also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom. Or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.